could you give any kind of examples of like the core things that you think that society needs to unlearn about gender? That's like, feels like a massive question.
Okay, welcome to my TED Talk about what society needs to unlearn about gender. My name is Isabel Adomakoh Young, and I am an actor and a drag king and a writer and some other bits. A drag king is a person who isn't conventionally read as being a man, wearing masculinity and playing with masculinity in order to like undermine it or to learn something from it or to challenge people's preconceptions. It comes in so many forms now, and even the idea of a drag king, like there's so much breadth within drag that includes just kind of drag things as well, where people are, you know, they're not necessarily just exploring masculinity or men. It's very exciting, it's very broad. So first, my first foray into drag, I still count it as being 7 years old, playing Moloch the Wizard with like a cloak, and I remember having painted on wrinkles on my forehead. And it, honestly, I mean, I joke, but like it really did, it felt like a little moment. I don't know, there's something, I think it can be very affecting trying on like the opposite gender for the first time. So there's me, Isabel, I'm a cis woman. And then there is Izzy Aman, which is Isabel in drag. And so that's kind of the base level. And then beyond that, I might take my drag performance in any direction according to like an act that I'm doing. And so that could be anything through different eras, might be very different characterization. You know, I've done everything from like Bruce Willis, like action hero, military, kind of like Top Gun vibes, to Prince, to Bob Ross, for example. So I would say it's quite fluid. I wouldn't say that Izzy, I mean, he tends to have an American accent. He's quite like, he's often very like sensuous and like erotic and kind of almost a bit shy, like quite a retiring character. So Pex is our drag collective, Pex Drag Kings. And we've been going for, I think, 8, 9 years, possibly 10 years. We have such interesting responses to our shows. I think maybe the transformation isn't a shock, or at least the visual transformation isn't a shock, but I think people often have quite kind of visceral responses to the like believable masculinity that they see on stage. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily our only goal, but I think part of what we're trying to do is to help people see that masculinity is performative and that wider, you know, more widely gender is performative. And so if we manage to do that, then we've done a good job. But yeah, I've definitely had people come, I mean, of all ages, of all genders, of all sexualities come up and be like, oh my God, I fancied you so much. Like, what does it mean? You know, I thought I was gay. I thought I was straight. I'm a 6-year-old woman. What does it mean? You know, I mean, I live for that stuff because I think it's just so great to be able to kind of shake people up a little bit and like show them what's possible and yeah, just like open minds and hearts. I hope that we get to do that. I think drag is capable of showing us what is possible and showing in a way how kind of weak the structures are that we cling to so hard in our day-to-day lives. I know that was my experience coming into it. You know, I never want to get too kind of preachy about it, but having been in workshops where people try drag for the first time and having been in one myself, you know, back in the day when we started exploring this, I remember the sensation of, you know, trying on a few different masculine things. You know, we were walking around the room and how might it feel if you were a number 3 on the scale of drag, on the scale of masculinity, you know, a number 5 on the scale, 10 on the scale, what does that look like? Does anyone actually do that? No, of course not. Suddenly realizing that a lot of the things that I did naturally, or that I thought were natural in my day-to-day gender expression, were actually so deeply socialized, and that I was kind of abiding by all these invisible rules that I hadn't even known were there. And getting to shed that or explore the other end of the spectrum, even for an afternoon, was so liberating and has defined my gender expression to this day. And also just defined like how I move through the world and what I feel free to do and free to express in myself, even beyond gender maybe. And so I hope that seeing that might open a door, a little crack in someone that might, you know, lead them to believe in the possibility of more than what we're taught. I absolutely think drag has been like formative in terms of both my sexuality and my gender expression. Not necessarily in the sense of like doing it changed my mind, but doing it gave me the permission to explore and be honest about what my mind really was. It's sort of baffling actually, because I think back to that day when Temi came up to me in the street and was like, oh, we're running this drag session. And I was like, drag? What's drag? And then, you know, cut to 10 years later and it's like such a huge part of my life. And I'm just like, God, what if Temi just hadn't asked me along? Like, what terrible invisible rules would I be following? Or like, would I even have come around to the ability to express that I'm queer? Or I don't know. What a thought. But yeah, I think being among queer people who can express themselves freely, and being given the permission to do that has been so important. I'm so grateful for it. And the same with drag, yeah, just like exploring masculinity allowed me to drop a lot of elements of femininity that were not serving me and I did not choose. I remember after the first few PEX Drag King sessions, just like, I will sit how I like to sit, and people can make of that what they will. And it isn't always with my legs daintily crossed, and that is fine. That's a tiny example, but I think it's a metaphor for a much wider idea about proprietary, like about who gets to own space and who gets to take up space. You know, race is at play in everything that anyone does to some level. But I would definitely say it's part of my creative practice, including drag, for sure. I think with drag, yeah, it's funny. I remember having a very specific realization in those early days of exploring drag kinging, where we were doing an improv where it's just like, you wake up as a man and you just like brush your teeth as a man and like have your breakfast as a man. And so it's not, I think what I found really interesting about that was that it wasn't about performing it for an audience. It was like, what if you just existed in this way? And I was getting on the bus as a man, and I was like, oh, I'm getting on the bus as a black man in like public space with like other people. Obviously, you know, we've seen many like versions of what that can be and what the like worst versions of that, of what society's response to that can be. And it just really landed with me in a way that maybe it hadn't before. I think a lot of my acts tend to be about a sort of unracialized masculinity, or I don't know, they're not specifically about the racial element. But then, for instance, when I do something like my Prince tribute act, it is all about the beauty of what he did as this kind of like androgynous, mixed race, like cross-cultural, just incredible melting pot of a human. And so there, I think it's much more visible than, for instance, in my Bob Ross act. But also, I love the idea that like I, a black woman, can play Bob Ross and it be weirdly sort of believable. It's like manifestly not believable, but it kind of maybe is. And again, it's just about that kind of like cracking things open and being playful. I think definitely in the early days of PEX Drag Kings and of my own king development, performers, PEX members often came in with a lot of rage. And I think part of the reason I was drawn to it in the first place was like, oh my God, great. I can like poke at men and fucking slap back. Do you know what I mean? And parody some of the worst elements of toxic masculinity. Get back at your ex or at that person who made you feel small or whatever. You know, there's so much completely valid, like, realistically trauma that needs to be worked through. And like, I'm absolutely here for drag doing that. But at the same time, I think there's a much bigger conversation to be had about patriarchy and about toxic masculinity. And while ultimately we do want to make it smaller, I think that's not only through like cruelty of satire. I think it's also about helping people who live and enforce it to realise that they don't have to do that and that there are other much more beautiful and loving options. And if you're only ever going to be angry, it's going to be hard to bring them on board. I've had some of our most diligent fans were like boys from my private school who were like, you know, I can't say we're aiming to cater to them, but like they loved it. They really did. And they learned from it. And they I think they found it really fun and interesting and exciting. And in a way, I think that's like, it's really important to reach wide audiences, because as much as we want to like sing the experience of, you know, our more obvious audience base, it's also about helping other people see stuff and feel safe to come and experience something. And that's why I'm very keen that drag not be exclusively a thing for queer spaces or queer audiences, because ultimately gender affects everyone. And Lord knows men suffer from toxic masculinity, you know. I'm not gonna say as much as, but they also suffer from toxic masculinity. You know, no one benefits from these systems ultimately. But I do absolutely believe that like drag and performance art and PEX Drag Kings like is contributing to a movement and a cultural movement that I hope will lead to change. I don't think that's going anywhere. For me, if I get to a point where activism and creativity can live in perfect harmony, where the stories that I'm participating in telling or telling myself are things which will spur change and help people have maybe a different perspective on life, and where I can help amplify the people that have those insights, because I'm very aware of, you know, my angle not being the only one that needs to be seen from. I think that would be great. And if I get to work across screen and theatre and still make weird performance art, that would be just fantastic. Yeah, I'm keen not to be pigeonholed, I think. Often when I'm feeling a certain way or asking myself a big question, art is what I reach to help me work through that thing. I think it's so valuable for that on a personal level, but also on a level where one artist can be asking themselves one question and they can make a piece of art that then makes generations after them ask themselves that same question. And that's what I just think is the real magic of it. So for me, it's about making sense of the world and making sense of other people, making sense of myself, and sometimes abandoning sense altogether and embracing the sweet, sweet, chaotic nonsense of life.